So hello, everyone. My name is Harrison Campbell, and I'm running the session today. So welcome to my session, which is called Literacy on Stage, Finding What's Real by Making Believe. I'm your host today, Harrison Campbell, and today is Friday, November the 5th, and we are in session D3. So before I get started with the session today, I'm just going to do a quick territorial acknowledgement. I am joining you from the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta in Canada today, and so I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional land that I myself am situated on. So I am situated on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, which comprises of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, which include the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary, where I am right now, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3, and the University of Calgary, where my research has been done and conducted, is situated on land that is adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and the traditional Indigenous name for this place is Mohkinstsis, which we call the city of Calgary. So thank you very much for joining me today, and I look forward to our dialogue together. So without further ado, I will share my screen. I hope that the screen share works well. All right. So can you all see that screen? Is it working?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. So as I've said, my name is Harrison Campbell. I am a doctoral student, sessional instructor, and research assistant at the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. I also teach at St. Mary's University, which is a small Catholic university, also in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And I look forward to talking to you today about work that I do bringing literacy on stage. So this is an overview of today's session. So I'm going to start with a brief discussion about who I am, and then I'd love to know who the two of you are. And since we're such a small group, we'll have time for hopefully really meaningful introductions. I will then talk briefly about autonomous and ideological literacies and how my students have defined literacy in the past through a series of activities. I will then move into a discussion with all of you around what you think literacy is, and I have some prompts and questions to assist in that discussion. And then I also have some words and phrases that my students have used to define literacy in the past to help guide that discussion as well. I also wanted to talk today briefly about my research process, which uses theatrical phenomenology, which I know sounds really intense, but I promise it's not as intense as it sounds, and how I approach drama through what's called new literacies. And so they bring the space of literacy and drama together really nicely in my mind. And then we'll have a discussion around how we can hopefully approach literacy differently, both to engage curriculum and curricula, but also to talk about different complex literacy practices that can be brought about through performance and different literacy skills like decoding that I think are really beneficial within a theatrical environment. So hopefully we can get through all of that in our time together this afternoon. So just so you know a bit about me and my background, I'm a developing literacy scholar, not quite there yet, and a PhD candidate in Canada. I was an ELA and drama teacher, among other things, in elementary and secondary schools in Canada. So I've actually taught every grade but grade 4, although not for very long. It was only for a number of years. And then I came back to academia. And I work in the professional theater community in my city of Calgary, with an Indigenous-led theater company called Making Treaty 7 Cultural Society. So I am a settler supporter in that environment. I help with grant writing and things like that. And my research is generously funded by the Government of Canada through the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, or SSHRC, and also through the Killam Trusts, which is an organization that works with some of Canada's leading research universities to fund innovative research in the arts and in the sciences. So that's a little bit about me really quickly. I see more people joining us, which is fantastic. Welcome to all of you. You're just in time for our shared introductions as a group. So I will stop sharing my screen for just a moment. And we are quite a small group. So I would just invite you, if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about who all of you are, since we have feedback on your mic there. you could just mute yourself. Sorry about that. If your mic isn't working or if you have lots of feedback on your end, you're also welcome to introduce yourself in the chat or using the raise hand feature if you'd like to do that. I just like to know who's in the room, a bit about where you're from, what you do. Happy to hear from anyone. So if anyone would like to get us started.
Hello, my name is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hello, my name is Vishma Vikram and I'm from New Delhi, India. And I'm basically a lecturer in physics at the JNU University of India. And I am currently working as a lecturer or a professor. And my age is currently 35. That's all.
Well, nice to meet you. Would anyone else like to introduce themselves quickly before we move along? Hi, Michelle.
Harrison.
My name is Michelle. I'm from Geneva, New York, Western New York state. And I'm trained as a teacher, but then didn't end up following that path in the traditional way. I work for the National Center for Race Amity, which is an educational organization working in cross-cultural, cross-racial collaboration and social justice. And I also work in community education wherever I am. So,
Well, nice to meet you. Thank you for coming today. Would anyone
Hello,
else like
Harrison. This is Dilshad. Yesterday we met in a room, Zoom room. Myself, Dilshad. I'm a mentor teacher in Delhi government in education, and serving as a teacher about 15 years. So happy to hear you again.
Well, thank you for coming today. It's nice to see you again.
Thank you.
Would anyone else like to introduce themselves?
Yes, hello, myself. I'm Mohammed Fahmuddin. I'm a Delhi government school teacher. I'm also a mentor teacher, and my age is 32. I'm from India. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So it's nice to meet all of you. In the spirit of relationality, I always like to start conversations with introductions and to know a bit about who I'm talking to. So without further ado, I'll move into the research sharing. So thank you very much for indulging me with that series of introductions. So I will move now into a discussion about autonomous and ideological literacies. And so Brian Street, a literacy scholar, coined these terms before 2006, but 2006 is when the article that I read a lot of his work came out around that time. And essentially that talks about how literacy needs to be both skill-based and more traditional, and also ideological in nature. So autonomous literacies are about skill development, reading, writing, speaking, listening, viewing, and representing. And ideological literacies are about understanding that the reader or the student or the learner brings their knowledge, identity, and being to literacy conversations, and when they learn to read, write, speak, listen, view, and represent. And so sometimes these are viewed in a dichotomous way where they're kind of opposed to one another, but Brian Street really wants to bring them together. So for a holistic literacy understanding and holistic literacy development, you need to have both of these present in your teaching in your classroom. And I think that drama, or at least I hope to make the case for drama and process drama, is a good way of bringing these two things together in relation within your literacy teaching and literacy learning environment. So these are some examples that my grade 8 students have used to describe literacy in the past. And so the picture on the left was drawn by a student of mine who liked to talk about literacy as a way of connecting with people, which I thought was very appropriate given the fact that this conference is centered on relationality and connection. And we're all making connections with people from all over the world as we attend sessions today. So I really wanted to share this image that they drew about connection with you all today. And then the jar of buttons on the right-hand side, the picture next to it, was a student who liked to talk about literacy as a storytelling device, as something that makes the world bigger, as something that expands your worldview and perception. And they use the phrase, a universe in a single button. And so as a writing prompt and as a literacy activity, I collected all of the most unique buttons I could find through a combination of talking to drama teachers and going to thrift stores and finding them in all kinds of nooks and crannies. And I put them into a jar, and then students would draw a button out of the jar or be given a button out of the jar and have to write a story and a prompt based on the button design. So the button would have to exist on a character's piece of clothing, and then they would have to come up with the backstory for that character, talk about how that character interacts with the world, and things like that, just as a place of beginning with fiction writing. And so that student really resonated with that assignment. And so that jar of buttons has kind of become a symbol for a literacy event or a literacy experience within my own teaching. So these are just a couple of examples of work that was done both as a part of the formal study I'm going to be discussing today and just as a part of my own teaching and development over time. So I hope that those are a good place to begin our conversation today, because I wanted to spend time actually talking to all of you about what you think literacy is. These are prompts that I sometimes use with students when trying to understand what literacy means to students. So I'll sometimes just ask them directly, what does literacy mean to you? But if they're having trouble coming up with that, or they're having trouble defining literacy in that way, what I also do is I ask them things such as, where do you see literacy in your own learning? Does literacy look different for you in different subject areas? Usually students gravitate towards describing literacy within English language arts and social studies. And so I'll encourage them to think about language in subjects like math and science, because literacy is still very much present in STEM-oriented courses. And so trying to get students to think about literacy in that way. Sometimes when talking to teachers, I'll ask them when they're teaching, when do they use literacy in their own classroom? And so sometimes teachers are more or less aware of the literacy that they're also using within their own teaching. So that can be a good prompt for teachers to think what literacy is. And also always remembering that literacy is something we engage with beyond the classroom as well. So it's not just something that happens within the context of the walls of a school, but it's something that happens before, during, and after school. And we happen to see just a snapshot of it in our classrooms and in our teaching. And so we also talk about diverse ways of showing understandings of literacy. And I'll get a bit into the performative aspect of that a bit later in the presentation. But to the three of you present today, I would just be curious to know if you're comfortable sharing what you think of when you think of the term literacy. So if you'd like to share, feel free to unmute or turn your camera on and let us know kind of your thoughts on this. You can also post in the chat if you would rather, if that's more comfortable.
Hello.
Hello.
According to me, literacy is when you have knowledge, when the competency of some knowledge. I know that it is not only differentiated with the books, with ideas, with the experiences, what we have everywhere around us. This is actual literacy, what I denoted. And if we go on the second prompt you had, when you were teaching, when you did use literacy in your own classroom. Actually, we have the students from the diversity of students is from different backgrounds. Some of them are well from the good background. They are from the richer family background. Some of them are from the disadvantaged group. So all over there are different stream of literacy. There is some for the poor students, the students from the poor background, and when they are only a single home and they are living in a rented home, the knowledge they have is different from those persons who are so much privilege of everything. And in this way, when we started teaching something, when we started exploring them something that we are going to read about the parliament. So these kind of topic becomes so hectic for them. This just won't listen that what is the parliament actually is. where is the people and how is the voting is to be done. So these kind of thing we can relate them, that every 5 years we have a election type thing, and you wondered, you saw that people are going to cast their vote, and then they started, yeah, I saw that in the recent past there's something happened like this. So according to me, the literacy is the competence of knowledge in whatever field it is means, and to correlate it with the teaching learning process is actually our job. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really like how you talked about the environment and the location of students as impacting literacy, the linguistic landscapes, if you will, that they kind of live in and exist in, and how that changes the way they engage with language. Really nice. So thank you for sharing. Would anyone else like to share their thoughts?
Yeah, I like what you said as well. I was thinking of literacy as being the ability to connect whatever you're reading into multiple idea areas, and to be able to be fluent in discussion and application of things, being able to see yourself in whatever it is you're interacting with.
That identity piece is really interesting that you bring up, being able to see yourself, because a lot of times many of our students can't see themselves in what they're reading. And so that's sometimes part of the reason why they disengage from reading. The protagonist doesn't resonate with them because it's kind of the same protagonist over and over again.
Yeah, or the history doesn't reflect, their part in it, their culture's part in it as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Would anyone else like to share or respond to this prompt? I really personally resonate with both of your definitions that you've brought up. So I do a lot of work with linguistic landscapes, so understanding the environment that the students find themselves in and how that impacts their engagement with language. We also work really closely with a lot of schools in our area to really diversify libraries. So making sure we get as many unique authors as we can into libraries, making sure we cover as many topic areas as we can. The university where I'm situated also has a fantastic children's book collection. And so they help to share that with elementary schools to make sure that there's lots of different source material shared in elementary settings, as well as the secondary settings that I work in more commonly myself. So thank you for that quick discussion on literacy. We're going to come back to these prompts a bit later on. But these are some of the words that students of mine have been using to define literacy, and I can walk you through them to kind of give you a bit of background information and a bit of the story behind some of them. So as a place to begin, I'll just read you out the words that are here. So I've had students connect literacy to ambition and ambitious practices. I've had students connect literacy to the idea of freedom or being free or becoming free. I've had students talk quite a lot about hope as a tool for literacy, especially in relation to sharing of stories. So not just the reading, but also the communicative aspect of sharing stories. Speech is a big one. I think because I was a drama teacher for many years and I always made them talk, I think speech naturally made its way in with all of the different monologues and oral work that we would do. Trust was a big one. This was big for many students kind of within the learning community more generally, and drama often needs a great deal of trust to be used effectively in the classroom, I think. So that's where that word comes from. Connection, similar to the image I showed you at the start of the presentation. Many of my students have talked about literacy as a way of connecting with people, usually through things like speech. And usually the connection leads to other words on this list like trust and hope with other people, which was really interesting to see. And then one of the more unique ones that a student has used in the past was as a way of unveiling, as a way of understanding both themselves and the concept of literacy differently. And so I'll share just a couple stories from these words, and as they all relate to understanding, and that was kind of the umbrella term the students all agreed upon. The unveiling term really stands out to me because that was a student who, as a way of presenting what they felt literacy was, they got onto stage and they did a choreographed dance piece on stage to the sound or to the song Human, which was their favorite song at the time. And then they also painted on stage while doing this choreographed dance. And so they had a easel set up and they had painting materials kind of scattered about the stage. And then they had a dancing area in the front that was safe to dance on with no materials strewn about anywhere. And then they would naturally, as the chorus of the song came up, they would step back towards the easel and they would paint on the easel. And by the end of the song, and the song repeated a couple of times to give them enough time to do this, they had painted their own self-image on the easel in the background. And then what they did is they took their self-image, their self-portrait, and they put it in front of themselves, and they kind of held it in front of themselves, and they sat down and let the audience look at it, and then the lights faded down. And that whole process that the student wrote about and talked about after was about how they had finally been able to see themselves reflected in some of the things they were reading in class. And they were finally able to see themselves. They started watching some different media sources. They were watching different YouTubers and different movies on Netflix. And they were finally starting to see people that looked like them and made them feel recognized and seen. And so they made this whole wonderful piece around unveiling. So
Harrison, may I ask what age group that was, or how old was this person?
they were in grade 8, which in
Wow.
Canada would have made them, they had just turned 16 at the time. So it was quite impressive for a 15 to 16-year-old to do. Yeah. Most of the students in the study that I'll be referring to are between 13 and 16. So 16 on the high end and then 13 on the low end. I have done some work more recently with high school students, but it has been in a different capacity because of the pandemic. So these words and performances were created pre-pandemic, and then we're still shifting into we're still shifting back into theatrical spaces in Canada where I am. We're starting to reopen theaters and spaces and doing performances together, but we're not quite there yet. So it's a gradual shift into the reopening. So another really powerful word from this list that I thought I'd share a story with is another student about freedom. They had a difficult home life, and not difficult in the way that it was abusive, but difficult in that they came from a quite great deal of poverty, and they didn't have access to a lot at home. And so they would come to the school early every Monday morning, and they would take out a new book from the library. And they read quite quickly. They read a lot of books. In my time with them, I think they read like 50 or 55 books because they were taking books out every week. And they would read them both at school during breaks and at home after doing homework. And the books kind of allowed them to reimagine themselves in a different context. So they often read fantasy and they often read science fiction as a way of kind of connecting with the world differently and seeing themselves in a different context. And so what that student did in her performance was we used 3D projection technology, and they projected wings behind themselves on stage that looked like the pages of books. And then the wings would lift as they were talking about literacy and reading as a way of becoming free from their kind of lived circumstance. And then the wings would kind of flap and move in the background while they were talking. And the pages that were projected on the back wall were taken from books that she had read that year. And so she picked kind of pages of her favorite books, and we digitally scanned those and recreated them into a projection for her. So those are just two examples of kind of really powerful moments for me in this process of coming to understand literacy as so much more than the reading and writing. Even though the reading and writing does need to be a foundation for literacy, students are often engaging with it quite differently and quite uniquely. And so I will share access to an article that kind of goes through the stories of all these different words if you want to see them in more detail after the presentation. But those are always two that stand out to me, and I always like to share them at presentations and conferences. So, and that student, the Freedom student, was 15 when she did this piece. So just in case you were curious. So yeah, this was the study that gave birth to all of those words and those performances. And I just wanted to talk briefly about kind of why I did what I did and what I did. Keep in mind that this is pre-pandemic. And so the post-pandemic version of this study that's going to be following up with high school students is going to look a little bit different. But in the junior high version of the study, I started with semi-structured interviews. And I did that for a number of reasons. I really wanted the student's voice to lead the conversation. So I really wanted students to have agency and authorship and the ability to describe their own identity in a very conversational way. And so the questions in the interviews were very similar to the prompts I showed you at the beginning, with some additions, such as what things they relate literacy to at school, and some ways that they'd like to show their parents and teachers their understanding of literacy differently. The student who did the dance piece with the painting and the unveiling, she started actually dancing in her interview, as she thought that literacy was storytelling with every part of your body, was kind of her definition for it. And so we actually started dancing, and I dance very badly. So she was dancing very well. I was dancing very badly. But we were quite the sight in a school administrative office, just dancing in this interview room. We pushed the table out of the way and actually had space in the room to actually do stuff. The principal chuckled at us while we did that, but it was quite an interesting moment. So we did interviews like that to start the conversation, and then I actually invited them into a process of journaling. And while I started with text-based journaling, just because that's something they're all quite familiar with, it's quite a common teaching practice in schools in my jurisdiction. I quickly moved into pictorial data. So I let them draw images, I let them take pictures, with the condition that they don't take pictures of other people without their consent. And there was ethical considerations around that and ethics forums that went out. But they all followed that rule very well. It was mostly pictures of environments or themselves, or things that they owned that made them think about literacy. And then I actually taught them how to do like very early coding of data. So I actually invited them to sit with me as a group and talk about like, what is most important in these pictures? What does this picture make you think of? What does it make you feel? I had transcribed all of their interviews by that point. And so I had their interviews printed, and I let them sit and read their whole interview and like either change or amend or add additional context to things that they said in their interviews. That all became part of researcher memos and researcher notes. And researcher reflections throughout the process. They also had total control over what from their interview actually made it into the data dissemination. So if there was something they said that they were no longer comfortable with, or something that they wanted to rephrase, they had the ability to either omit or edit anything in their interview or in their journal as well as we went through the process. And that was just to make them feel as comfortable as possible and have as much agency as possible in kind of what was shared through the research. And then they identified the essence, which is the phenomenological term, or the key word of their literacy experience, and they personified it through performance. And so those words that you saw earlier, the freedom, the ambition, the hope, those were all essences or keywords of literacy for my particular students. And essences is just the very phenomenological term of how to kind of come to terms with an experience. And then different things that they used to actually perform all of these essences and keywords were the 3D projection, the wings that I mentioned. There was shadow tableau. So we had sheets come down over the stage, and then they would do like shadow puppet shows and shadow tableau. The song and dance choreography. So I've mentioned the dance choreography and the painting. I also had a student play the ukulele live on stage, which was delightful. I love the ukulele, brought me great joy. And she sang a song about literacy as a way to show your ambition, or a way to show your skills, and a way to show who you are. And I even had a student learn ventriloquism just for this performance. So their grandfather was a ventriloquist. They had a ventriloquist dummy, which is one of my irrational fears. So it disturbed me greatly when it first came into the study, but I'm like, oh God. But they learned how to do it from their grandfather. Their grandfather actually came into the school and showed other people in the class like how to do it and what makes a good ventriloquist. And then they actually used this puppet, this ventriloquist dummy, to do their whole performance through the dummy. So, and that was the essence word for that was the hope word, because whenever their grandfather told them stories or shared experiences from his life, it gave them hope for the future. Their grandfather was just delightful. He was, at the time, he had just turned 90, and he like came in and was just so delightful. So he was a part of the performances too, even though he was not in junior high. His grandchild was. So those are just some examples of kind of how the data collection process built over time and how it was eventually shared. When the performances happened, we invited the school community, so that included teachers and other students in the school. We invited local politicians because the school was a charter school, which in my jurisdiction is quite unique. So we invited people from the Ministry of Education with the students' permission. And we also invited people from the university to come witness, so academics in the literacy space. And this study was a part of my master's work. And so my entire examination committee came to the performance and watched it and gave feedback. So we tried to make it as much of a community event as we could. Again, pre-COVID, so we could all gather in that way. And so that was just a very nice series of events that night. So it ran for a couple of nights in a row, so as many people as possible could come. We had food and we had music, and it was at the school, so it got the school a lot of positive exposure in the community, and kind of demonstrated the school to some people who were less aware of it because it was semi-private. So that was kind of our journey there with research. So and why did I go on this journey of research? And so I wanted to share these kind of 3 pieces of scholarship that really inspire me and how I think of literacy. So first and foremost, I think that drama and process drama is an aspirational pedagogy. I love drama. I would put drama in everything if I was like the Minister of Education, if I had the authority. But a lot of my work is showing teachers how drama can become a part of subjects interdisciplinary in an interdisciplinary way. So it's not that you have to have a dedicated drama class, although that is ideal and lovely. You can bring drama into ELA. You can bring drama into social studies. You can even bring drama into math if you really want to and really want to try that. Or science. Some of the most creative people I've ever met are scientists. And when you kind of show them how they can communicate science differently through artistic means or through installations, they do some really fascinating work when you kind of bring those worlds together. And so what I think drama does really well is that it moves literacy into this space of reading and writing, but it also allows for seeing, feeling, moving, acting, and interacting. And I think that feeling is what I think is the core nugget of what makes drama so special. We don't always allow students to feel in our teaching as much as I would like us to do. And so I think drama can be a really nice way of allowing them to feel and engage with their emotions and talk about their responses to text and just engage with text really differently. And I choose to do that through multimodal approaches. So I choose to bring in as many visuals as I can. I choose to get them out of their desks as often as I can. I choose to allow them to be the presenters as much as I can through oral or through other means. They really love radio drama in my classes. So radio drama, if they're less comfortable being on stage, something you can do is you can have them record their performance ahead of time and then broadcast it like a radio show so that the class listens to the show and listens to them, but doesn't have to see them. So that can be a way of engaging your more reluctant stage performers. They really get into that. They get into all the old timey, like they have old timey music from the 20s sometimes playing before, and because they think radio is this ancient thing that happened like 300 years ago. So when you actually show them how radio works and you have them record using radio techniques, it also reminds them that it is still very much being used for communication. So yeah, that's fun. Yeah, sometimes I feel old in drama because sometimes I'll have like a floppy disk as a prompt and they're like, oh, it's the save icon from Word. And no, it's the floppy disk. And so sometimes you feel old in drama, but sometimes you can also just remind them of fun things like that and have those moments. And when these things come together, the term that I use for it is literacy in the round. So if you've ever attended a show in the round, it's a stage that's circular and the audience kind of surrounds the entire stage. And the purpose of theater in the round is that the audience is interacting with the performers as much as possible and that the performers are offering different perspectives in the performance depending where they stand on stage. So there's a lot of staging that keeps the actors moving and keeps them kind of presenting to different parts of the audience at different parts of the performance. And the reason I use that metaphor in my work is that I think literacy should be seen in that holistic way where the perspective we have on literacy can change depending on how we look at it and where we're looking at it from. And people can offer different perspectives in how they engage with us in our dialogues about literacy. So that's a bit about my rationale using new literacies. And then this is just some scholarship that I think is really interesting in my own work and that if you're interested in this space, I would encourage you to take a look at. So literacy events was coined a long time ago by Heath in 1982. Literacy events in her context were about the use of bedtime stories, specifically in relation to if students had access to bedtime stories, they were more likely to engage with content over time. And so students who came from higher socioeconomic status households were more likely to have access to bedtime stories on a regular basis. And so they were more likely to engage in reading themselves. But the shift more recently in 2020 into literacy as event instead of literacy events has seen that onus shift from the home into the classroom. And so the teachers and the school can provide literacy events for those students who don't necessarily have those events at home. And the benefit of that in a school context is that it kind of equalizes the playing field a little bit. So it allows the students to have access to text and access to literacy regardless of their socioeconomic status, because as long as they come together in the school, they have access to something that the teacher is producing. So that's a really interesting dynamic, and I really enjoy those articles for that. If you're curious about holistic and social literacy experiences in classrooms, Marco was a drama teacher and published an article in 2015 that I really enjoy that's on the reference slide at the end that I can share with you around the use of drama specifically, and she did it in junior high settings. Emotional and personal connections to content are something that I've talked about briefly that I think drama can be really effective in. And Hansen wrote a really good article for that I can share. And then because this is a relational conference, and because so many of our wonderful sessions have been talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, I think it is also important to mention that literacy and critical literacy learning can also be done through drama. So if you want to engage with drama through a more social justice oriented lens, there's things like Theater of the Oppressed or Theater for Living that can be really effective in bringing that social justice element into your teaching, especially if you're dealing with a text or a book that deals with heavy social justice topics. The drama can be a really effective way of dialoguing about those topics and actually allowing people to share diverse perspectives on those topics in a really respectful and dialogic way. You do have to monitor that engagement carefully because you don't want a student using that platform or that space in a negative way in relation to the justice lens. But as long as you're careful, there's some really interesting conversations you can have with students. We've been having a lot of really interesting conversations in Canada lately about truth and reconciliation. If you're not from Canada or you haven't seen Canadian news, they've been discovering the graves of unmarked graves of children at residential school sites in the hundreds in Canada. So there was over 300 discovered in British Columbia and another 250 discovered in Manitoba, which is an eastern province. And so we've been having a lot of conversations in Canada about what that means and how we engage with truth and reconciliation and the importance of truth and reconciliation and the calls to action from Indigenous communities. And we often do that through drama, through Theater of the Oppressed and through Theater for Living as ways of starting those conversations. So those are just some articles that can help to engage literacy differently. But I did want to pause here for a brief discussion, just in case anyone had questions so far, anyone wanted to talk about a way that they might want to engage with literacy differently or anything at all. So if there's anything at all you'd like to ask or share, please take a moment to do so.
I wasn't familiar with that bit of news from Canada, and that's quite heart-wrenching. It's wonderful that there's a space to talk about that through use of Theater of the Oppressed kind of thing, type discussions and through different modalities, because sometimes just a straightforward discussion about oppression and violence towards other cultures, it can be too much. And so to have a space that can relate it in a way that's palatable, but that's also accessible for students to engage at multiple levels of emotional maturity or I don't know, engagement. I don't know how to say that. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah, our federal government in Canada just recently recognized September 30th as a day for truth and reconciliation. So it's meant to be a day where the country shuts down and different organizations offer workshops on truth and reconciliation across the country. And then everyone's encouraged to spend that day going to workshops and going to sessions and talking about that topic. And even though it's not necessarily enough for just the one day, it's at least a starting place for conversations that then hopefully trickle throughout the year around that topic. So
That's so much braver than our country and the way we're handling things right now. I noticed that Dilshad mentioned that he uses it in uses theater in social science.
Yeah, would you like to talk about how you use theater in social science?
I use it in to teach different kings and rulers of India, like in history. It started from the ancient history, and which is the Indus Valley civilization. Then after it, so many rulers ruled over India. So I enact different kings. Mala to motivate my student to act as kings and queens, and what they said at that time, and what kind of rule, what kind of administration that time. So it really helps me to deliver my content, and all my students always very happy and excited to participate in the plays of ruler of India. That's it. I use it like it theater.
That's so fun. I love theater for history because it helps to kind of get into that mindset, because history is often so different from where we are now.
So different, yeah, yeah.
That sounds like so much fun. I want to be in your social science class now.
We can.
Yeah. So no, those are great examples of how to use it very effectively in different contexts. And there's lots of different literacy opportunities happening there in your social science class. So they're engaging with multiple means of representation. They're generating meaning together. They're coming into relation. They're embodying their learning.
Mhm. We taught about 4 5 subjects in social science in India, like history, geography, and civics, which is we called political science and economics. So we taught 4 subjects in social science, and an extra subject like disaster management. So it is a vast subject for us in India. I don't know, is it in your country also divided into 4 subjects or 5 subjects? And but in our country, social science is about of 5 subjects. So much syllabus, so we have to use some kind of things, refreshing things to uh, deliver our subject to our students. So I use many times theater activities in my classroom, like computer aided learning. We show so many old plays and other things to my students. So it is a nice experience for me to use theater in education.
Mhm. No, thank you for sharing. In Canada, they condense the core subjects into specialties. So they take language and literacy and history and geography, and they put language and literacy together into English language arts. And then they put social studies and geography into, or history and geography into social studies. And then they combine those into what's called humanities education. And then they do the same thing on the STEM side. So they'll combine like mathematics and numeracy together, and then science, technology, biology, physics, chemistry together into science, and then they'll mush them together into STEM. And so that we kind of approach it that way in terms of our structure.
In Delhi, we also started about 16 to 20 schools of SOSEs, School of Specialized Education, like STEM, like in your Canada, in your country.
Mhm.
So we are trying to introduce so many new things in India, especially in Delhi. So
Mhm.
we are very happy to see so many changes in our time. So I'm glad to be a part of this revolution of education in Delhi.
Mhm. Well, thank you for sharing and for the work that you do there.
Yeah,
All right. Um,
thank you.
Thank you. Moving forward, just for sake of time, there we go. There's one more question I'd like to explore with you all while I have you here for the last few minutes, and that's kind of how can literacy be used to engage with the curriculum or curricula differently? And so in Canada, there was research in the early to mid 2000s around inviting students into conversations with curricular concepts. And the reason you would do that is because it would increase the authenticity of their learning, is what the research showed. They would be more likely to engage with what you have in the classroom if they can better understand how you are connecting their learning and to a curriculum that actually matters to them. And that would increase the validity of participatory practices in schools, it was hypothesized. And the reason I bring up curricula now is that in my context in Western Canada, our province, so we have provinces instead of states, and our province, our premier, is pushing a curriculum that is not supported by 98% of our teachers. So there's a new curriculum update coming that has been like almost universally rejected by the educational community that the government is kind of pushing through anyway. And so there's a lot of conversations where I am right now around engaging with curriculum. And if the new curriculum is put out and piloted in a way that's not supported by almost everyone, how do you engage with it in a way that actually matters to students? And so that's a big question up here in Alberta. It's so bad that the New York Times and the Telegraph have both talked about our proposed curriculum because it omits many things that should not be omitted. And we always say in Canada, when the rest of the world pays attention to us in that way, it's usually a bad sign because it's usually for something horrendous has happened. And indeed, the curriculum that they're proposing is something horrendous. And so this is a big conversation for us up here that'll be ongoing as this kind of gets piloted this year and then hopefully gets revised next year, but we honestly don't know. We're in a very tight spot with curriculum. So I just wanted to bring up the fact that in your own jurisdictions, when you're thinking about curriculum, think about ways of engaging with it authentically as best you can. Hopefully your curriculum is a better document than the one we have proposed, but there are ways to work with curriculum creatively if you're kind of limited by what's there. And then just in terms of literacy skills and complex literacy practices that I think drama is very good at developing, if you want to connect it specifically to skills for the purposes of your curriculum, I really find oral reading confidence in students grows tremendously when you use drama, especially radio drama in the class. They get much more confident in speaking in general, but they also become better orators and better speech givers through the use of drama, especially iterative drama that repeats over time. Another good example of skill development is fluency. So I found that a lot of my students have had increased fluency through the use of drama in the classroom, and they also have increased comprehension. So while I don't always use test and testing as a benchmark for success, they do tend to do better on comprehension exams following a unit that uses drama and play to bring literacy into the classroom as opposed to classes that don't have that exposure. And so fluency and comprehension are closely connected. And then I always find oral reading confidence to be a nice little boost to an additional skill to talk about. Some other skills that I think are really effectively built through drama is they become very good at decoding, especially if you make them read Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is not written in a language that they are familiar with at all. And so if you have them read Shakespeare and then do little notes on the side or in the margins about what that actually means in modern day English, they build a lot of really good decoding skills for that. And I always encourage them to talk to each other and to try and relationally understand with each other what words they're less familiar with mean. So rather than just immediately coming to me as the teacher and being like, what does this mean? Please tell me. Well, talk to each other, read the sentences around the word you don't understand, see if you can parse together some element of understanding, take a guess, and then come to me with your proposal of what you think the word means, and I will confirm or redirect you in a direction to help you understand that word better. And that can really help to build decoding skills and context-specific vocabulary. And sometimes the things they come up with for words are so outlandish and so ridiculous that it'll make you just smile and laugh as you teach. And so I encourage them to be creative. And if they genuinely have no idea what a word means and they just need me to help redirect them a bit, I tell them to come up with the most ridiculous definition for the word that they can, because then it at least gets them in a more positive headspace with decoding. Because often when students are having trouble decoding or understanding context-specific vocabulary, they have a negative connotation with that because they feel like they can't get it. especially if they're English as additional language learners. They can have a lot of anxiety around context-specific vocabulary and decoding. So if you make it fun for them, if you tell them, if you come from a place of laughter and enjoyment, and you make yourself vulnerable too by sharing stories of vocabulary you may not have known when you were a student, that can all help to lessen anxiety in the classroom. And I think through those practices, but also through everything else in general, I think they do become better at being reflective and building their own reflective ability, especially in relation to writing. But in general as well, they become stronger communicators. They talk to each other more frequently. They become reflective in their learning through the language and also through how they communicate the language. So I hope I've convinced you in our brief time together today that drama can be a fun, if not ridiculous, way of engaging with literacy and engaging with literacy differently. I can share these resources with you if you're curious about reading articles in this space more directly. A lot of these are Canadian specific, so if you haven't done a lot of reading in the Canadian educational sphere, this might be a good way of engaging with it for the first time. I'm also going to share with you a link in the chat just now before we take questions to a resource I've created for you as attendees to this session. So it's a document of drama games and activities that you can use. And what it does is it walks you through how to play the different games, what the different games are. There's, I think, 21 pages worth of games in here. So what I've done is I've compiled games and activities from all the drama teachers I've ever worked with. And the deal we have with each other is just make sure you share them widely and with people. So I hope you get something out of those games and those activities. And the only condition to using them is please share them with colleagues and friends. So I'll take any questions you have now, and I will stop the recording for the questions just because we are coming up on our time shortly. I don't want to be that person that takes it back to the main room. So thank you.